Well, I remember one day my mom said to me, Colton, you know what? Sometimes it's just easier to be sick and lie in bed than it is to get ready and be an adult. Because sometimes being an adult is just really hard, and it requires us to make hard choices, which is exactly what we're going to be talking about this morning as we continue our Grow Up series, where we're talking about growing up into maturity. And when the Bible talks about what this maturity looks like, it's a maturity where you lack nothing, where you experience the fullness of Christ that is available to you. And this fullness looks like a life of joy and peace and purpose and satisfaction and health and relationships. Yet, there's seasons of life where those things are lacking, and quite bluntly, we're saying in this series that the reason some of those things might be lacking in your life is just because of immaturity. And we're talking about how to grow out of immaturity into this fullness that is available to us. So why don't you pray with me as we dive into some of the hard things that we need to face. Father, I thank you for every person in this room. I thank you that you're working in their lives. Holy Spirit, I pray that you would give us the strength to grow up and to move into maturity to the point where we lack nothing. I pray that this morning, where there is anxiety, that it would be replaced with peace. Where there's anger, where you would move people into experiencing compassion and all the other things like this. I pray that we be a group of people that live in the fullness that you say is possible for us. I pray this in your name. Amen. I'm the director of student ministries now here at PAC, but a few years ago I was an intern where you spend time with different leaders, and we had these different challenges that we needed to get done within the time frame of being an intern. And my challenges ranged all the way from doing 2,000 push-ups in 24 hours, that was something I needed to do, to rescue a prostitute. And they were all over the place, and we had to accomplish these tasks. And then also we had these projects that we needed to help out with. And one of the projects that I was assigned to help out was to help Tamara put on a worship conference here at PAC. And so I was pretty excited about it too, because I actually enjoy putting these talks together and doing them. And so this was going to be my first opportunity to do a talk to an adult audience. I'd been spending some time preparing messages for kids and been doing those, but this was going to be my first time that I could preach in front of an adult audience. And it was going to be about worship, and I decided to talk about consistency in your life and how that will lead you to experiencing more powerful worship. That was basically my talk in a nutshell. So I was pretty excited about this thing, and then it was going to happen right after we got back from Mexico. So another thing we needed to do as interns was raise enough money to be able to go to Mexico City and experience some of those things that you're hearing these people in these videos say that they're experiencing. And so as interns, we went down and experienced those, and it was an incredible experience for me as well. I remember being in Mexico City, and it just felt like some of these pieces that weren't put together in my life yet were coming together. It felt like maybe for the first time I was beginning to experience hearing God's voice regularly. It felt like for the first time I was beginning to see God in my day-to-day life and seeing how He orchestrated things together for the good of people. And it was an exciting time in my life, and I felt full. I felt like I was really beginning to understand this faith thing. And then I came home excited to now enter into this worship conference. But when I got home, I got a call from my mom, and on the other side of the phone she said, yeah, so it turns out that lump in my breast, it is actually serious. It's triple threat, negative, terminal cancer, and there's not a lot of hope, and I don't know what we can do at this point other than pray. And so we prayed, but I remember in a moment my excitement for faith and my excitement about this God was rocked. And I just remember feeling this tension between how can I be experiencing such a great reality with God in one moment, and then in the next moment it feels like I'm not even sure if I want to be following this God at all anymore. How could He let something so bad happen in my life? And then there was this tension. And I considered quitting the internship because I was like, I just don't know if I can do this with this God. And so I needed some space to breathe. So my cousin Jesse and I went to Winnipeg. And we hung out in Winnipeg for a while. We stayed in Winnipeg really late. And he had just got back from Australia. I had just got back from Mexico. So I think it was just a combination of this tension that I was living in, and we both had the travel bug that we just weren't satisfied with a night in Winnipeg. So on our way back from Winnipeg around Whitehorse, I said something kind of stupid. I looked over at him and I'm like, hey man, you want to go touch the ocean right now? And what he should have said in that moment was, no. Or even a sarcastic yes. But he went, yeah. And there's just a little silence in the car. And he looks back at me, he's like, wait, are you serious? You want to go touch the ocean? It's like, what I should have said was, no. But I went, yeah. Silence in the car. Another moment goes by, I'm like, okay, wait, are you serious? And what he should have said was, no. But instead he said, yes. Next thing we know, he was living with our grandparents at the time. We're in our grandparents' basement at 3 o'clock in the morning, pulling clothes and guitars out and filling up the car. Our grandma wakes up and asks what we're doing and sees us loading up all this stuff into the car. And Jesse literally looks at her and goes, don't worry, Grandma, we're just going to go wherever the wind takes us tonight. Not what any grandma wants to hear or experience at 3 o'clock in the morning. Our poor grandma. She sent us a text after we left going like, what would Jesus do? We felt a little convicted, but we went for it. And we came up with this ridiculous rule in our head that makes no sense whatsoever. But we're like, okay, if we get past Brandon, we can't go back. It's done. If we get past Brandon, there's no turning back. We have to commit. So the whole way we're processing whether this is a good idea or not between Portage and Brandon, because we're like, okay, we'll use that as a buffer. Because there's a few different things that make this story even more ridiculous. It's Friday night. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. We're driving west. Jesse is scheduled to play on a worship team Sunday morning, which is a responsibility that he's supposed to fulfill. And here at PAC, the music just doesn't happen. People don't show up. There's a pretty lengthy process that happens throughout the week to get the quality of music that we do. So it's not a good thing to just maybe try to go touch the ocean on a weekend that you're supposed to be playing worship. I am teaching on consistency in worship the next weekend at a worship conference. And here we are, we're driving to touch the ocean at 3 o'clock in the morning. We got to Brandon, we stopped, and we're like, okay, are we going to do this? And then we drove past Brandon. And at that point, we're like, I guess we're doing this. No going back now. We got to go for it. So we get past Brandon and we get to Regina, and we're like, what are we doing? This is crazy. But we're past Brandon, so I guess we got to commit. Jesse tried to find a replacement for guitar, and he couldn't do that. So we realized we didn't actually have enough time to make it to the ocean. So we changed our plan. We're like, we could make it to the Calgary Zoo, high-five each other, get back in the car, and drive back to make it on time for Jesse to walk up on stage and play guitar. Solid plan. Let's do it. So we just keep going, and we make it to Calgary. We go downtown, we high-five each other, and then in a moment realized how tired you are when you haven't slept for a really long time and you travel a quarter way across the country on a spontaneous whim. And I don't even think it would have been safe for us to drive back. So all of a sudden we have to start making these humbling calls like, yeah, I don't think I'm going to make it for worship on Sunday. I'm in Calgary. Oh, how come? I wanted to touch the ocean and we didn't make it, so we're here in Calgary now. So somewhere in here, Linda is cringing right now because of these phone calls that we had to make. So we got stuck in Calgary. The next day, there's this huge snowstorm, and the highways are closed. We end up getting stuck in Calgary for another 2-3 days. And I remember sitting in Calgary, and now we're just stuck there. And I remember going inside of this A&W and sitting across from Jesse, and it felt like the weight of all of these things that were rushing through my head hit me. And all of a sudden I felt paralyzed as this question came back up again. Like, I'm here. It just created this space in my life. I'm like, okay, when I go back to Portage, what is my life going to look like? Am I going to continue to do this internship? Am I going to continue to give my life to this God? Or am I going to go back and live my life differently? And I was hiding. I went into hiding, and I just needed to create space to figure out, what am I going to do? Because on one hand, I've been experiencing this goodness, and on the other hand, I don't know if I want this. And so I hid from the hard choices that I knew I was going to have to make. I knew there were some hard things coming up, and so I went into hiding to try to figure out what I was going to do. And as I read through the devotions this week in our YouVersion app, we took a look at the story of King Saul in 1 Samuel, and I felt like I could relate to him in that moment when he goes into hiding. You see, Israel has just been freed from slavery, and now they want a king. And God says, well, I'll be your king. And the Israelites go, no, we don't want you to be our king. We want like a physical human king. God says, okay, I'll give you a king. So they go and they cast lots, and it's just kind of picked by random. We'll take a look at how that happens in 1 Samuel chapter 10, starting in verse 17. Later, Samuel called all the people of Israel to meet before the Lord at Mizpah. And he said, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, has declared. I brought you from Egypt and rescued you from the Egyptians and from all the nations that were oppressing you. But though I have rescued you from your misery and distress, you have rejected your God today and have said, no, we want a king instead. Now, therefore, present yourselves before the Lord by tribes and clans. So Samuel brought all the tribes of Israel before the Lord, and the tribe of Benjamin was chosen by lot. Then he brought each family of the tribe of Benjamin before the Lord, and the family of the Matrites was chosen. And finally, Saul, son of Kish, was chosen from among them. But when they looked for him, he had disappeared. So they asked the Lord, where is he? And the Lord replied, he is hiding among the baggage. He is hiding among the baggage. And so we see this king who is presented with a hard thing in front of him. Because leadership comes with some benefits, but it also places you in this position where you consistently have to make hard choices, or you can take the easy way. And Saul gets chosen at random to be this first king, and he realizes how hard it's going to be, the hard choices that he's going to have to make, the hard things that he's going to have to enter into, and he feels the weight of it. And he goes and he hides. And he hides in the baggage. And we get this, right? We get hiding from the hard things. We get hiding from the hard choices that we know we need to make. We hide in different things like security. We know that God is calling us to something. Maybe it's a career change, or maybe it's something where you know God is asking you to change something major in your lifestyle, but that change would be risky. You know God's calling you to do it, but you don't. So we hide in security and we say, well, I'm safe here. Or we will hide in being busy because it's easier to be busy than it is to enter into some of the hard conversations that we need to have at home. There's some relational tension, and it's just easier to stay busy than it is to enter into those different things that we need to enter into. Or we'll hide in distraction and disruption. Instead of entering into that hard thing that we know we're supposed to be entering into, we just distract ourselves with TV or substance, or you spend way too much time over there when you know you need to be spending time over here. And so we distract ourselves from the hard thing that we know we're supposed to be entering into. And King Saul, when presented with a hard choice, he goes and he hides in the baggage. When we fast forward the story in the Bible, a little bit later on, we get to take a look at another king who's presented with a hard choice. And this king's name is Jesus. And Jesus is presented with a hard choice. He's asked to give his life on a cross. And guess what this king does when he's presented with a hard choice? Find it interesting that this king too goes into hiding. Jesus as well goes into hiding when faced with a hard choice. Let's look at how Jesus goes and hides when faced with a hard choice. This is in Luke 22, starting in verse 39. Then, accompanied by the disciples, Jesus left the upstairs room and went as usual to the Mount of Olives. There he told them, "Pray that you will not give in to temptation." And so he walked away about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, please take this cup of suffering away from me. Yet I want your will to be done, not mine." Then an angel of heaven appeared and strengthened him. He prayed more fervently, and he was in such agony of spirit that his sweat fell to the ground like drops of blood. At last he stood up again and returned to the disciples, only to find them asleep, exhausted from grief. So Jesus knows there's a hard choice. There's a hard thing he's going to have to enter into ahead of him. And he goes and he hides. So we have two different kings now that both have gone into hiding from the hard thing. And they make space in their life to decide what they're going to do. But there's two different responses to how these kings come out of hiding. And I think it's because they hide very differently from the hard thing. One king, when he's called higher, when he's called to grow up, he hides away from God. God calls him to enter into this thing. God calls him to enter into this identity, and he runs from it. And he runs away from what God is asking him to move into. Then you have King Jesus. And this king, when presented with a hard choice, doesn't run away from God, but he runs straight to God. And he goes and moves toward God and says, "God, are you really asking me to do this? Is there any other way?" But I'm not trying to make excuses. I'm just asking, is there another way? Because I want to do what you want me to do. And he moves towards God instead of away from God. One king bails, and he goes and he hides by himself amongst the baggage. And then you have King Jesus, who grabs some friends with him. And they might not even understand the weight that Jesus is carrying, but it says that they fell asleep because of the grief that they were experiencing. They could see that their friend was about to enter into a hard thing, and so they entered into that hard thing with him. And Jesus doesn't enter into his hard thing alone. He includes people in the hard thing that he's going to go through. And he asks them to pray, and he enters into it prayerfully with community. Very different way of hiding than hiding in isolation and not telling people what's really going on inside of you. Not really telling people the hard thing that you need to do. Not actually answering the question in house church the way your heart knows it should. And we say something else when we know we should really say this. We don't include the community in the process. And then both of these kings eventually have to come out of hiding. Both of them have to come out. And that's the thing about hiding, is we can't stay in hiding forever. Eventually you're going to have to come out. Eventually that hard thing is going to be presented in front of you. Eventually you're going to have to make a choice. And they both come out very differently. So I'd like to suggest that where you hide and how you hide determines how you come out of hiding, determines how you're going to make that hard choice, how you're going to enter into that hard thing. One king, King Saul, eventually he gets found, and they drag him out, and they force him up in front of the people, and he's forced into the hard choice. Jesus, he gets strengthened by the presence of the Father, and he comes out willingly and strengthened and ready to make the hard choice he knows he's supposed to make. And they have very different responses. As we read the story of King Saul this last week in our devotional times, we saw a king who consistently made easy choices and found the easy way out when presented with hard things. We see a king who makes bold proclamations and then goes back on them when it's inconvenient for him. We see God ask him to wait for something and not to enter into it at this time. And instead of waiting, he just goes for it, and he enters into something too early before he's ready, before God says, okay, now you can go for it. And he makes immature, childish choices. And the result of that is that King Saul goes down in our Bible textbooks as the example of the disobedient king, the king who you don't want to be like, the king who took the easy way. Then we have King Jesus, and he comes out and he enters into the hard choice. And he walks straight into his hard choice, and he does the hard thing he knows God's calling him to do. And he walks into his own death, and he dies. And the consequences for making the hard choice have unbelievable repercussions. Because when Jesus enters into that hard choice, it releases salvation for the planet. It means that we can have this fullness, that we can actually have lives of joy and peace, that we can experience the fullness, that we can taste our food and experience healthy relationships, that we can sleep at night because there's not a million things that are creating anxiety inside of us, because we're filled with the peace that goes beyond understanding. The repercussions of the hard choice have incredible reward. So the band's going to come up, and we're going to take communion together as a church. And King Saul, remembered as the disobedient king, took the easy way out. Nobody is raising a toast to King Saul anywhere. Nobody celebrates King Saul. But today, millions of people around the world are going to raise a toast to the king who did the hard thing. Millions of people for thousands of years now have been entering into celebrating and raising their glass to this king. That's pretty significant. So as we do this, what this is that you are invited into this. You're invited to enter into the hard thing. So I'd like you to keep at the forefront the next hard thing that you know you need to enter into, the next hard choice you need to make. And as you do this, be reminded of the two different outcomes of King Saul versus King Jesus, because this one is very different. So the band's going to play, and there's going to be a slide that goes up behind me, and you can follow those to grab the juice and cracker. All right, we're going to give a toast to King Jesus. But before we do, I want to remind you that there's a promise attached to this. And the promise is that if we enter into the Jesus way, if we enter into that next hard thing, if we enter into the hard thing, on the other side of the hard choice is life, is resurrection, is hope, is peace, is joy, is the complete fullness of maturity, not lacking anything. That's what's on the other side of this hard choice. And that's why we give toast to this king, because it's all available through him. So let's give toast to him and thanks to him. He said, "This is my body broken for you." And my blood spilled out for you. You guys can take a seat for a few minutes. eventually, I had to come home from Calgary. And I had a few different options. And the decision that I made was to come back to PAC and to say sorry. I want to continue on in this internship. And then I sat across the room from Tamara, who I was supposed to be for days now helping her prepare for this worship conference. And now it was like 3 days before now, and I totally missed out on helping. And so what I was expecting as I sat across from her was for her to correct me or reprimand me or say, okay, well now you can't actually enter into these things. Instead, as I sat across from Tamara, she looked at me and she opened up her Bible, and she opened up to Psalms 84. And she read these verses to me. What joy for those whose strength comes from the Lord, who have set their minds on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. When they walk through the valley of weeping, it becomes a place of refreshing springs. The autumn rains will clothe it in blessing. They will continue to grow stronger, and each of them will appear before the God in Jerusalem. And she looked at me and she goes, yeah, Colton, I just really see you as somebody who's on a pilgrimage. You're somebody who's on a journey, and right now you're going through a hard thing. Right now you're going through some hard stuff. But I see you. If you move towards God right now, and you go up there and you preach the sermon on consistency on one of the most inconsistent weeks you've ever had of your life, and you move back towards God, and you continue on with this internship program, I believe not only will you be strengthened, not only will you continue to grow in strength, but as you do that, as you walk through this hard thing, you're going to be somebody that brings life and resurrection with you everywhere that you go. And even though you're having a hard day, you're going to bring life and resurrection to people. And so I went up on one of the most inconsistent weeks of my life and teached on being consistent, which made me feel like the biggest hypocrite in the world. But I experienced so much grace when I moved towards God. And it has empowered me to live the life that I now live, where I get to stand up in front of you today and talk and do what I love to do. And I don't necessarily know what my life would look like if I would have hid and didn't move back towards God like King Saul. So here's the invitation that I'm going to give you this morning. As a community, we continue to talk about growing up. It's going to require us to make some hard choices. It's going to require us to move into that next hard thing. And so I'm going to invite you to hide differently. I'm going to invite you to share what's really going on. I'm going to invite you to move towards God instead of running away from Him. And I'm going to invite you to experience the fullness of maturity. So there's going to be prayer teams here at the front, and this is a great first step to change how you're hiding. Because you can tell somebody what's really going on, and then you can move towards God and talk to Him, and you can do it prayerfully. And what we saw from the other king, King Jesus, is that when He did that, on the other side was life. And that is what is available to you. So this week, as you enter into the hard thing, as you walk through the valley of weeping, as you enter into difficult things, my prayer for you is that you would be strengthened by the Lord, and that you would continue to grow in strength. May that be the reality that you experience this week as you move towards Him. Bless you guys.